Well, hey everybody, welcome to another Fridays with Rocky. We're going to have a really great discussion today. Our guest to discuss housing as a human right is Ismail Kayem, and he's with the Housing Justice Coalition of Charlotte, or Charlotte Housing Justice Coalition. Some administrative things, a little bit about me. So I town at the law firm called Hull & Chandler, but in prior lives, I was a executive director at a nonprofit, a community action agency that provided Head Start throughout 5 counties in North Carolina and workforce development in 2 counties. But probably where most of you, if you do know me, as my tenure at the Charlotte School of Law, where I was the supervisor for the Community and Economic Development Legal Clinic for 5 years, where I providing direct legal services to Charlotte area community organizations, neighborhood groups, and just public charities and nonprofits. I got my start in law as a legal services attorney, representing tenants in public housing and private housing, defending against mortgage foreclosures, and then, of course, getting into providing community economic development services as an attorney, working with developers of affordable housing, both at a very neighborhood level and at more sophisticated, like dealing with tax credits level. Again, I've got the disclaimer here that this presentation and any related materials are for informational purposes. So any type of discussion back and forth between us does not make a attorney-client relationship. As you'll learn, our guest Ismail is also a North Carolina licensed attorney. And I would assume that he's probably not trying to pick up any clients out of this presentation, as he's here in his role with the Housing Justice Coalition. Before we jump into that, though, I kind of want to put this sort of in the arc of where we have been. And so the last 2 sort of episodes, we have kind of gone from nonprofits and discussing sort of the nuts and bolts of nonprofit law. And I think we're due for another nuts and bolts of nonprofit law. I think maybe we'll do a Ask Rocky Anything About Nonprofit Law episode, probably maybe the next episode or something like that. But we've been asking this question: can community economic development and the nonprofit sector increase social mobility in Charlotte? During episodes, we highlighted the Raj Chetty study that showed that Charlotte was 50 out of 50 out of major cities in social mobility. I think it was 49th out of 50, or was it the other way around? Either way, it wasn't good. And so so we started to talk a little bit about economic development. You're like, well, what is this? So I kind of, during that previous episode, I provided, well, one, there's no standard definition, but I was that community economic development are efforts to develop housing, jobs, or business opportunities for low-income people played by nonprofit, non-governmental organizations that are accountable to residentially defined communities. And as we saw with last episode's guest, the Westside Community Land Trust, they pretty much are a community economic development organization because their efforts are to produce affordable housing. It is a nonprofit 501c3 located right there in Enderley Park. And they're accountable to a residentially defined community, the West Side. That is a residentially defined community. During previous episodes, we talked about the 3 approaches, and this is where we're going to lead into how the Housing Justice Coalition of Charlotte fits into this. The first approach, again, is the economic growth promotion strategy. And I think that one reason I want to put this slide up here is to kind of show sort of a foil to what you're going to learn about from the Housing Justice Coalition, because the economic growth promotion strategy about social and also about community economic development really comes down to this notion that if we just grow the economy, everything else will just work itself out. And so you remember seeing this thing about Chiquita. Well, we will use our resources. Remember, the government, the local government, both the county and the city, and also the state of North Carolina through the One North Carolina Fund, threw in millions of dollars to lure Chiquita to Charlotte. And the idea was that Chiquita would create so many jobs and raise the tax base and just add to the economy. And so this is this idea of utilizing incentives. Sometimes there's a crass way of calling it smokestack chasing, but this idea of using the public purse to try to create private dollars that will then kind of help everybody in the long run. As you'll see with the Housing Justice Coalition, they're probably not fans or not, their approach is very different than this. And then we talked about the second approach, and we're not really going to go into it a super lot, but again, the localism approach, which really focuses on nonprofits, focusing on local, less on trying to draw businesses from outside and more about trying to build businesses and housing and things. The third approach that we talked about, and I think it's going to play a big role with our discussion with the Housing Justice Coalition, is the economic justice development. So as you can see in this picture here, it's an organized group of people and they're marching. And I think that this notion of organizing is going to play a huge role because it's going to be a huge linchpin in this approach to community economic development. So whereas a group like the Westside Community Land Trust, while I don't think that they are necessarily opposed to community organizing, they actually are trying to act more as a developer. They're trying to either develop their own housing, they're trying, in a specific location. But this approach is going to really be about, the linchpin is community organizing and to a certain extent, direct action, meaning that we are going to show up at City Council and with a whole lot of us, and we're going to say, this is what we want you to do with our public dollars in relations to affordable housing. This approach, again, it goes beyond the concerns of economic growth and localism to considerations of how wealth, broadly defined, is used and distributed. So you'll see this, I think, in our discussion with Ismail and about the Housing Justice Coalition. This approach to focus is on the developing economy is to strengthen the community. And so as we talk about economic development, this approach is going to say that the community is just as much an externality, it's just as much a factor to consider as how much money is involved, how much land costs, that the actual effect on the community is key. And we'll talk about how the community, if it's not being included, has to exert itself to become part of that calculus. Part of the calculus as, the land, the businesses, and the aim of this approach, and as we talk to Ismail and we discussed this notion of housing as a human right, as the organization, this approach is a more just or fair production and distribution of functions. And as I said last time, the best way to kind of think about this approach is a little bit like the former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders and this notion of distributive justice, which is distributing, right? It's like if there's too much wealth here, we distribute it in a more equitable and fair distribution. And so very much different than the economic growth approach with the Chiquita Banana and all that approach to growing the economy. And so, so I just kind of want to give you that framework there. And some of the strategies, and we'll talk about strategies about what the Charlotte Housing Coalition and what their strategies are, but typically these strategies include working through local and senior governments to eliminate the marginalization or exploitation of particular people within the community. So big example would be community groups in Flint, Michigan, forming a coalition and petitioning your government to fix the darn water because everyone is getting sick or getting, everyone knows about that story. So that's an approach. So it's very different than some of the approaches to, well, let's just create some jobs. And this is going to be a bit more, I wouldn't quite, I guess the word is confrontational, or at least it has to address, is more assertive, about what these needs are. Another approach to this, and to the extent that Westside Community Land is structuring your nonprofit, taking your a co-op or a land trust or a community development corporation to favor those most in need. And so the example again with the Westside Community Land Trust, it is intentionally located. It's not the Valentine Community Land Trust. It is the West Side Community Land Trust because historically resources and folks have been underserved in that part of the city. And then the other approach, and we probably will have an episode about this, I've got an expert on that for a future episode, but this approach also talking about strengthening non-cash mutual aid norms and practices. And so this a little bit about this, unincorporated and also incorporated nonprofit organizations. Perfect example of mutual aid, economic justice approach to community development would be someone like a group like Charlotte Uprising, which, you know, if you follow them on Twitter or something, if somebody needs bail, they shoot it's effective, but it's also not exactly the most, you know, like it's not your standard, like donate here on our website, you know, and here's your tax deduction letter type of deal. And so I do think that for those of you out there in the community who are interested in this, we will start to bring you some programming about mutual aid and the legal issues related to mutual aid in a future episode. So let's get to brass tacks, and we're going to introduce ourselves to the Housing Justice Coalition of Charlotte, or Charlotte Housing Justice Coalition. And I'm pleased to have as our guest representing is Mr. Ismail Qayyum, Esquire. So he's a new lawyer, and very congratulations. And so Ismail, this is a little bit about him. He believes that legal advocacy is most effective in conjunction with community organizing. And he's informed by his formal education and experience working in West Africa as a researcher and advocate for Friends of the Earth Liberia. His time spent assisting and working alongside tenants fighting for their rights in New York City through various internships and legal clinic. That makes me feel good because having taught legal clinic, you know, it's a good thing. The law students come out of legal clinic. They do good things in this world. Showed him the centrality of community-based empowerment in pushing for rights and societal transformation. And the culmination of these experiences has led him to conclude that legal services should serve the people. He's a recent graduate of the City University of New York School of Law, and he additionally holds a master's in science in violence, conflict, and development from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And he looks forward to serving the communities in his home city. So he's a native of Charlotte, both as a community organizer and as a newly licensed North Carolina attorney. Currently, he's pursuing community economic development work as a Creating Equity in Education Fellow as he resides in his native West Charlotte. So at this time, we'd like to welcome you, Ismail, to Fridays with Rocky, and we're happy to learn more about the Charlotte Coalition.
No, I really, it's great to be here, and happy to, meet everybody and talk about these really important issues. I do want to give like a special thanks to Rocky for letting me know about this and kind of, reaching out to me and inviting me here. I feel like we kind of have like a student professor relationship, right? Like I graduated law school in 2019, and so it's like, in a lot of ways, I still see myself as a law student. You know what I'm saying? So it's nice to have like the clinical professor guide me. So that's
you can take you think out of me, as you can tell.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I think a good place to really start is I think to really kind of delve into the kind of like primary planks of the Housing Justice Coalition, sort of like what housing as a human right means. And then, from there, I can talk a little bit about sort of some of the work that we've done and are continuing to do. And then if there's time, I can talk a little bit about the history of the Housing Justice Coalition and sort of the particular historic and political moment in Charlotte that brought it into existence. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm from Clanton Park, and that's where I live right now. And yeah, I went to Harding. Charlotte native, and moved back at the end of 2019 to pursue. I actually didn't put it in the bio, but I got a fellowship through the Berkeley Law Foundation, and I was through that fellowship I was funded to do this same type of work with the support of the Latin American Coalition, which is like a great organization here in Charlotte. So
tell me about the Housing Justice Coalition. How did you get involved with?
Yeah, so I think so. The Housing Justice Coalition really, I actually began to get involved with it like before I moved back. I was sort of in it was like my last year of law school, and I was applying for fellowships, and I was like interested in doing like housing and community economic development work. And then through contacts like at the law school, because CUNY is a public interest law school, I was introduced to various organizers and people here in Charlotte. And this was around the time that the Housing Justice Coalition became very active around like the Lake Arbor campaign. right? And so like Lake Arbor was an apartment complex in West Charlotte that, you know, served like generally like I would say like moderate to like lower income residents. And but the units were like kept in like deplorable condition,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like there were incidents of people becoming sick from mold. There were like all types of things. But eventually, like the manager of the Lake Arbor apartment complex effectively decided that they were just going to like, you know, demolish the complex. And as a result, they wanted to just kick all the residents out. And so the residents had begun organizing like 2 or 3 years before, kind of on their own. And then another group, Action NC, Action North Carolina, which does a lot of housing and tenant-based organizing,
Mm-hmm.
became very involved. And then through the Housing Justice Coalition, it became kind of a conduit to sort of draw in people and nonprofits from all over the city together to stand alongside, you know, the tenants at Lake Arbor, and really kind of like, you know, bring public attention to what was happening, like go to city council, right? Like shame this particular property manager at Lake Arbor. And ultimately, recently it resulted in like a $500,000 settlement,
Mm-hmm.
as like the tenants through the Housing Justice Coalition and Action NC and all the organizers were able to basically get the North Carolina Justice Center to represent them in a class action lawsuit against the property managers at Lake Arbor. So that's really like, so I kind of, as I was moving back to Charlotte, right, like I
Mm-hmm.
became very involved with this. And the Housing Justice Coalition was like a space where you could kind of go, and we were meeting in person, right, and just like talk to different people, talk to different housing organizers, talk to people from different nonprofits, and just meet a lot of people in the city that were very interested. Like, and at this point, the Housing Justice Coalition had a very like loose structure, and kind
Mm-hmm.
of like it didn't really have like a. It's, I would say like the structure, like since I've been involved, it's become
Yeah.
much more like, I
One of,
think. Go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say one of the interesting things that we talked about was the fact that Housing Justice Coalition is not actually an incorporated typical nonprofit with a 501c3 or a 501c designation. And so I know in a previous episode I did talk about ways that community groups could organize themselves. And so just slide up is that what the Housing Justice Coalition technically is under North Carolina law is under 59B. There's the nonprofit at 55A is the typical nonprofit law. 59B applies to groups like the Housing Coalition, and basically, if there are two or more people meeting, I assume there's more than two people when you guys meet. I've not seen you guys before, in association regarding a typically not-for-profit purpose, such as neighborhood or community togetherness, the state of North Carolina will recognize you as an unincorporated nonprofit, an actual legal business entity. So that's an interesting thing for those of you out there who are interested in this type of work and don't want to get so bogged down in the paperwork. North Carolina State's a good state for this, in that it will recognize you as long as it's almost like a church, you start to meet, you'll be considered, something. But the state of North Carolina, if it would consider you an unincorporated nonprofit association, that you are regarded as a separate legal entity from your members. So that's because I know that it's one of those questions why you start a business, let's limit liability. But under this act, the Uniform Unincorporated Nonprofit Association Act, the coalition can hold property, transfer property in its name. It can sue in its own name. It can enter into a contract in its own name. And we'll talk a little, maybe we talk about community benefits coalitions a little bit. We can talk about that notion of coalition entering into an agreement in its own name. And it can inherit assets in its own name. So there is a law here in North Carolina that does apply. Now, again, if you're a nonprofit and you're looking to qualify for grants or things of that nature, you'll probably have to buckle down, get incorporated as a nonprofit, and apply for tax status from the IRS as a 501c3 to be eligible. But if you want to just get out there and start doing the work, you can, as long as you've got two or more people focused on a typically nonprofit purpose, such as, the work that is going on here, advocating for the poor and the homeless and those who are getting sort of railroaded by the current housing situation.
I was going to also say too that I think one of the benefits of the Housing Justice Coalition being a coalition is that you have nonprofits that are like representatives from nonprofits that are part of the coalition. So if you need to, like, say if someone is trying to do some work if they can kind of like build a relationship with an already existing nonprofit, then
Mm-hmm.
they may be able to like, apply for grants or like receive various forms of support that like only like a tax exempt nonprofit can receive.
So
So
tell
that's
us,
like,
so tell us about the current state of the coalition. So when you came in 2019, Arbor Lake was popping off. That was in the news. And it was big time. I mean, I had just sort of started practicing again here in North Carolina, in Charlotte, and I news about about the complex. So this is the period you came back into. What was the state of the housing coalition? Who was in the who were members of it, or at least how many members were it, and kind of what got you more interested in getting more focus on them as opposed to any other group or any other project in town?
yeah, I mean, so when I came back, I had, I was specific. I was introduced to one of the organizers from Action NC.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time they were developing their tenant organizing resource center, but it didn't exist. Or it had just started kind of around the time I came back in like fall of 2019, and I started around September. And so through that connection, I started going to the Housing Justice Coalition meetings
Mm-hmm.
and just realizing that like it was a great place to meet people and talk to people, but at the same time, I think the coalition was sort of like struggling to like see what its clear kind of focus was. And Lake Arbor was like the first
Mm-hmm.
project the coalition took on like as an actual coalition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very interested in what we call political education, right?
Okay.
And I was interested in kind of educating others and also continuing to learn myself on my own journey about the broader sort of like elements of political economy that have basically rendered housing unaffordable, inaccessible, and have made the entire housing market, precarious, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I take a very like, sort of structural systemic approach, right, to these particular types of issues. So what I did was like I started a reading group, right? That's really
Okay.
what it was. Like I started a reading group and we were reading a book called In Defense of Housing, right, which specifically looks at housing.
Is that book at the library, guys, by chance? Do you guys have that? Y'all, is that probably?
It's a versatile book, right? It's like,
Okay. I'm just saying for those of you out there, when you hear a book that we're sponsored by the library, so it'd be a great resource to get you a copy of this book if you're interested in reading. Go ahead, sorry.
yeah, no, we started reading In Defense of Housing, and In Defense of Housing, I think really started with like the big picture and really kind of broke down, like it gave like a sort of a historical analysis of like the housing market in the United States, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly the way in which like the housing market over time has become more integrated with the financial sector,
Okay.
right? And so the ultimate sort of argument of the book effectively is that, housing cannot be a human right, meaning everybody cannot have access to housing as long as housing is like remains like hyper commodified.
Okay.
Right. And so the book gives like a very specific definition of hypercommodification, primarily like the financialization of housing, which means that say when the financial crisis happened in 2008,
Mm-hmm.
right, it was the fact one of the major like causes of that were that basically these banks and lending institutions were trading these like collateralized debt obligations, these very complex and opaque financial vehicles that were really that could be traded like in the stock market that were backed by mortgages that existed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this was in addition to things like subprime lending, right? Like predatory lending that targeted minority communities that historically had been blocked out of the housing market because of redlining and other things like that. And so we were kind of taking like the long view of both the economic kind of development of the United States and like the global economy, while also looking at the particular historical lens of, racial exclusion, social exclusion, and other forms of like social and kind of like political aims in the way in which housing interacts with these types of with various like social and political aims. And so I think part of it was I was interested in like the Housing Justice Coalition's mantra is housing is a human right. And
Okay.
so I'm the type of person I was like, well, what does that actually mean, right?
Yeah.
I had a particular idea of what that meant. And this idea very much informs, all of the work that I've been doing since I've, come back. But yeah, I mean, it really started with an education group, like with a reading group. And it was just like
Okay.
it was some of the organizers. It was like people who had never organized, people who had never been involved in any kind of coalition, some people that I knew. And all of us over time began to like read this book together. And what happened was that as time went on and the situation with COVID deteriorated, like it became very like the things we were reading about almost like became, like they were like, it's like they were like breathed into existence, right? Like it was like there was, very visible like housing instability, right? Like there was,
Give us an
there
example
were,
of something that you read in the book and here in Charlotte. And we'll just talk. We'll just go ahead with this slide. Just an example.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the major things was that so around the time that the COVID happened, the governor enacted these lockdowns, these like shelter in place mandates,
Mm-hmm.
and so hotels were basically like places where people could stay. And you might know this, but also under North Carolina law, like there's basically like a fact-based test to determine whether a tenant who has resided at a hotel for a longer period of time can claim that like as their like actual residence, right? And if they can, that gives them the protections of like a residential tenant as
Gotcha.
opposed to like a hotel guest. And
So
like that might not sound like a large
as far as
distinction.
like getting evicted or something like that, if it's considered more of your domicile, you get booted out than if you're in a hotel. Then I mean, it's just like you didn't pay, just get moved.
Right, right. And so like if you're a residential tenant, you have like you have the protections of common law. And so what we were seeing basically was that people who had been staying in motels
Mm-hmm.
and especially like extended stay hotels for like months and months,
Hmm.
basically the hotels were losing profit because like people were not like booking rooms and making reservations, but yet they already had people that were staying there that were ordered to shelter in place. And so what we saw was that the hotels basically particularly the like Days Inn motel, which has now been demolished, I think likely because the owner sold it. They were basically like, illegally like kicking people out. Right. And this was like very much, this is sort of where you see the kind of instability of housing intersect
Hmm.
directly with like the carceral state and like and police brutality, right? Because what would happen is like the hotel manager would just call the police and just say they're trespassing.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically like a person in that situation, if they don't know their rights, they can't say, well, no, I have a right to be here.
Gotcha.
And then even if they say that, there's not a guarantee that a police officer may actually like listen to a poor, like lower income, tenant versus like a hotel manager. Right. Or, so, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, so what we were seeing basically was like people were being kicked out and some of the residents began to organize and seek assistance from the Tenant Organizing Resource Center with Action NC. And
Gotcha.
Action NC and the Housing Justice Coalition have a very like close relationship,
Mm-hmm.
largely because the creation of Action NC played a direct role in the creation of the Housing Justice Coalition.
Gotcha.
Anyway, all of us, people from the reading group that I had started and organizers from Action NC, all of us basically were thrusted into like a direct action role with like
Mm-hmm.
hotel tenants and
Gotcha.
basically trying to educate people about their rights,
Mm-hmm.
trying to link hotel tenants with legal services. I wasn't licensed at the time through legal aid.
Mm-hmm.
Also doing like direct outreach like to CMPD saying, okay, like, we would call the precinct and say, okay, like this is a civil matter. These are people that can assert their rights as residential tenants. Like,
Mm-hmm.
don't arrest them, right? Like don't arrest them as trespassers. So it was very much, and this was like sort of right when like this is probably like
Honestly, life or death situation, you would really think about it, right? I mean, if you
yeah.
got this pandemic and they're telling you to shelter in this place, right? Like quarantine, particularly during the first few months, right? It's Governor Cooper, like, you can't come out unless you're, better not come out. And these folks are, because of the way things are set up, they're having to live in a hotel. And now you're being told that, well, out of the hotel and you don't even have, because I guess the moratorium was on renters, right? It wasn't on, like evict. It was on the moratorium was on residential eviction. It wasn't a moratorium on trespassers in a hotel. And so
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
really disturbing because these folks are living in a hotel or a motel as their life-saving, habitat.
Like many of these people had families. Many of these people like received their mail like at the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And there was like a group like you were talking about those like unincorporated nonprofits. Like there was like a group of tenants, people that had I think previously been involved in Charlotte Uprising that were staying at this particular hotel that had taken it upon themselves to organize and do mutual aid and distribute
Mm-hmm.
food and water, but they weren't in terms of trying to like I think make an organized effort like against the sort of management of the hotel, like they needed assistance. And so it got to the point in the story, the hotel management basically like like cut off the power and the water, which of
Wow.
course is like is a constructive eviction, which is like, not allowed.
But I guess
Um,
if you're not considered tenants, then how do you have a constructive eviction? I guess so that's
right.
the issue. Yeah.
But it's like, how do you know what I'm saying? There hasn't actually been like a day in court to actually assert your rights as like, as a tenant. So,
Yeah.
basically through pressure, through organizing, through media shaming, actually like Braxton Winston came out, like we did a direct action at the hotel one day, and
Mhm.
Braxton Winston came out, the sheriff came out, basically like the hotel, of course, turned the water and the power back on.
Gotcha.
But unfortunately, what ended up happening was that the somebody had gone through, especially because the hotel management stopped providing basically like like security services. They were not like, people were basically just there on their own. And so like someone had gone through and like cut some of the wiring, which created a fire hazard. So
Hmm.
ultimately, the fire marshal was called, and they were the ones that largely that condemned the hotel for demolition and kind of,
Yeah,
said that everybody
right.
had to leave. But I will say those people who we were able to get represented by legal aid, like
Hmm.
I think were much better off in getting housing assistance,
Hmm.
and also, being able to like assert like some of their claims and their rights. So this kind of goes back to, in my bio, the connection between like legal representation and organizing.
Hmm.
But that's like one example like that I think of off the top of my head, which explicitly gets to the way in which, when housing primarily is commodified and is
Hmm.
done for the sake of profit, right? Like
Hmm.
even in an emergency situation during a global pandemic,
Hmm.
right? When people have been staying at a place for months and months, right? Like the profit of kind of an individual hotel manager took precedence over, like the lives of kind of all these people. And like not only that, but it's like people being pushed out during a pandemic is a health risk to everybody.
Hmm.
So I mean, this is like a very live example of kind of these contradictions that kind of exist in our hyper commodified, well, in our economy where housing remains like a hyper commodified
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think one of the things that you can kind of pull out of this is, and I think when I was a legal aid attorney, one of the things that it was so hard for me to kind of grasp of organizing, community organizing, like because legal aid attorneys have sort of we're better than other attorneys with dealing with community organizers. That many legal aid attorneys, we have an office. You come in our office, I diagnose what is going on with you. I may file a motion in court, and it's very an office based thing. And what I'm getting at is that when I started to understand the mind of a community organizer, and I started to understand underneath community organizing, I started to start realizing that, if I actually, as a legal service attorney doing community work, started to align myself more with organizers and kind of saw the effect that they did and maybe try to provide more support for them from a legal, we might see some, might see some more problems getting solved more effectiveness. So in the situation with Lake Arbor, a legal aid attorney, a typical one, may look at that and look at it from a legal lens, right? So these people are getting thrown out. They're, and so you sit there thinking in legally, it's like, okay, so legally, are they considered trespassers or are they residential? How am I going to argue this in court? Do they have standing? All these, using all this legal stuff. The organizer's like, I'm going to get a whole bunch of people. I'm going to find a city council person. I'm going to get the media, and we're going to show up there. And the effect was he turned the power back on, right? He turned the water back on. So before the lawyer could even get through his or her thinking about the lawsuit that I'm going to file or even declaratory relief, the organizer is already in there. It's got channel 9 and 3 and, well, maybe not 12, 36, and boom. But you get the effect is that you use the power of a direct action to force whatever you were having. So yeah, you could use a lawsuit, and that's one way of doing it, but lawsuits take time to kind of wind their way through. Even a declaratory action, you still got to schedule a hearing with the judge, and then the judge is on break, but if people need their things turned on, the organizer gets the people in there and gets the things done. And I think that's I think as we look at this sort of theory of change of the Charlotte Housing Coalition, is that organizing is key. I mean, I would assume maybe you guys would, you got to a point where you needed to file a suit. But I think legal aid, the first thing we would do was to file a suit. They would not necessarily think about organizing the community to try to force a change, immediate in the circumstances at the hotel or something. And through my experience, I've always thought that when organizing and legal services, or whether you call it social justice lawyering, interest lawyering, or something like that, when it is aligned with community organizing and intentionality, it's a pretty formidable force for I guess, as far as like a football analogy. So
yeah, and that's sort of like that's kind of part one, right? I think that was sort of like my entry into the Housing Justice Coalition, and it was sort of a very tight-knit network of existing housing organizers from Action NC, and then basically other individuals that had just joined this reading group through the Housing Justice Coalition. And so I think as we began to like develop and grow, I think we began to sort of look at sort of the actual kind of like origination of the Housing Justice Coalition. Like the Housing Justice Coalition in its origins was very much tied to like housing policy, the way in which like the city was particularly allocating money for the construction of housing that was like not affordable, like with a focus on things like more technical things like area median income, right, and the use of housing trust fund dollars, and actually the passage of like the initial housing, the $50 million housing bond, right, and so like that, and the Housing Justice Coalition originated actually out of the Keith Lamont Scott protest, right, like that's kind of like it was a part of that. It was a part that focused, one part focused on police brutality, and then the other part focused on like economic justice, right, and so and like we understand that it's not only that they're intersections, but they're, this is, if we look at it systemically, it's all part of the same system. So the Housing Justice Coalition was intended to be the vehicle that would advocate, organize, and fight for justice on the front of housing in Charlotte, in a city with that is rapidly like unaffordable, with a long history of housing discrimination, and housing being one of the primary forces that contributes to that lack of upward economic mobility. So that was it. And so I think from there, we began to have a heavy focus on policy as well, right? And like and the need to understand things like land use and things like rezoning. And around this time, I had been active in my own neighborhood association in Clanton Park, and so through a connection there, I was introduced to the Howie Acres neighborhood, right, which is like a historic African-American neighborhood in like Northeast Charlotte. And I think from there, basically, they were primarily interested in, they're like right next to NODA. So they see the effects of like gentrification, and they're very concerned about, a lot of elders and people on fixed incomes being priced out of the community. But there was a developer that owns several parcels of land, and the developer wanted to rezone the parcels of land so that they could do a higher density build, basically build a bigger house on the property. And of course, the residents were concerned about this increasing their property taxes. And so I guess like my name had kind of gotten around to them because of just, like I'm a native of West Charlotte, African American, and it's like this kind of like a community, a network of neighborhoods in the city. So that's kind of how I got involved. It was a very natural indigenous connection. And so like, basically from there, like we began to work directly with the Howie Acres Neighborhood Association to basically fight this rezoning petition, right? And that involved, we organized a meeting with their city council representatives.
Because I want to kind of pull back a little bit. Now, I really want to get into Howie Acres, but I think that this notion of land use. So I think we have talked about the lack of affordable housing, right, with the Lake Arbor and others. But I think it sounds like one of the other things with the Housing Justice Coalition is not just production and housing, but also decisions that undergird, that squeeze out the affordable housing, that is made available. In our last episode, we talked about, and I think this is, a huge topic here. And one of our guests was from the far West Charlotte, Northwest coast. Remember in the news at the time, about early December, the city council had voted to allow an industrial rezoning for a part of far west territory. And there was a land use process there, because I think understanding land use law and understanding the land use procedure is going to be real critical for neighborhoods. I think that the Far West folks were trying to push back. They had a change.org, petition of 1,000 people. It didn't quite get enough support, and the city rezoned that area to industrial. But so in many respects, I kind of want to bring them up to kind of put Howie Acres in kind of a comparison to, right? Because in Howie Acres, there's a developer. Howie Acres is a sort of a historically, African-American neighborhood. It is kind of like, it is sort of in north. It's sort of like a little bit north of Noda, right? It's like right across the road there where the.
Like North Tryon, Sugar Creek, Eastway, all like, it's right in there.
It's like, the sort of Asian Corner Mall is right there. And then you go up a little bit and there's that little church, and then you turn left and there you are into Howie Acres. So kind of putting that to the context of, we're in a context of a city and a county that tends to favor financialization, tends to favor, commercial or the best use of the dollar, right? The economic growth idea, right? That's our dominant idea of community development is let's just try to create jobs. Because I think with the extrajudicial territory, what did the city council people say? Oh, well, we feel bad that we're going to drop this industrial zone on this community that doesn't want it, but there's going to be jobs. That's what they said. That was even the most progressive people would say, I hear you, I see you, I feel you, but jobs, And so I think this idea is very powerful in the sort of the body politic is if there's going to be some jobs in it, then who cares about this neighborhood? Or is it going to be more property tax based? Who cares?
Well, it depends on which neighborhood it is. If this was a Myers Park or a Dilworth or, the traditionally sort of like affluent and, historically, white neighborhoods where the seat of political power has been in Charlotte, it would be a different conversation.
Yeah.
But when it's everybody else's neighborhood, then,
Yeah, they tried to.
That's just, you have to be honest about that.
A couple years ago, and they shot that down pretty quick. That was like a no-go. But so in that context of land use decisions and going to the city or the county and asking for a land use or asking for some money, we may get into that about developers. What happened in Howie Acres? So we've got this neighborhood. It's transitioning. There are developers, but what was this developer proposing? And give us kind of tell us the story of Howie Acres a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going to try to run through it as best I can. I mean, basically this was like a kind of probably like a mid-tier developer that had done a lot of work in like around the Beatties Ford Road corridor. Mm-hmm. And they basically wanted to they own these parcels of land and they needed to rezone them sort of because they were located like, near like, the Sugar Creek light rail, and they needed to rezone them to basically build like a higher density build. And so the residents were concerned about all the things I mentioned, their taxes going up and having like losing the character of their neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And so, for us, the first thing we noticed was that, the developer had not complied or like it had, it was very iffy whether or not the developer had actually complied with the zoning process, particularly the community outreach portion. Mm-hmm. So our entryway was to, number one, reach out to the city and zoning and say, listen, like, it looks like they haven't complied, right? Like there's been no actual community meeting. The developer had put some slides up on their website, and that was like the community meeting portion, which is necessary to move forward with the zoning project. So what we did was we organized a meeting with leaders from the neighborhood and the developer directly. And it was very contentious, and the community members the developer had brought their builder, and one other person, and the community members were like, okay, listen, like, we're not going to be displaced. You know what I mean? We don't want this in our neighborhood. And it just went from there. And then the next major thing we did was we organized a meeting with the city council representative for Howie Acres, which is Larkin Eagleston, mm-hmm. and the community. And we recorded this meeting. Like, if you go on our Facebook page, you can actually watch this meeting mm-hmm. In Howie Acres. Mm-hmm. And so, the community was just like, hey, we're not going to be displaced. We don't want this. Like, whatever. And I during the meeting, I asked Larkin, I was like, listen, like, how are you going to vote on this particular rezoning proposal? And he refused to answer. Mm-hmm. So our work in Howie Acres very much highlighted the fact that, the city can use its regulatory power and its, and basically like its power as a city to kind of create, to ensure like that housing is more available and more equitable. But in Charlotte, the city and the county have largely used their power for the benefit of profit maximization of various developers. And so when we say this, we don't just say it in a conspiratorial way, we actually follow the money. And when you look at campaign contributions, who are these campaign contributions coming from, right? Like to the campaigns of various members of city council and members on the county commission, right? When you look at, the actual like projects themselves, there's a long history of broken promises for affordable housing, but at the end of the day, big money always wins out. And this is a reoccurring pattern in Charlotte. And this is a structural problem. This is a structural thing that happens because of who has power in the political process and who doesn't. Communities, both residents, particularly in older African-American neighborhoods, and tenants historically have been marginalized and have not had that political power, right? And so our thing in Howie Acres really showed the need for residents that an organized community could actually build and assert that power. And what ultimately ended up happening was that the petitioner withdrew their petition because of the public pressure.
Gotcha. So in sort of to compare with the extrajudicial territory situation, that developer had already gotten before the city council, had already gone through the planning and city council. They were right at a vote. When you guys intervened right where the developer was about to put the application into the city.
I also did want to say too that what happened was that because of the meeting with Larkin and because of the applied pressure, like we did an action in the park in Howie Acres with Fox News, we had several articles published. The public hearing date was pushed back like at least twice. So because of the community was organizing and building pressure, they were able to actually push the actual date of the hearing back and give themselves more time to actually build and organize. I did want to put that point in there too.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think that we should definitely, we'll have to do a follow-up show about the notion of the community benefits agreement. I feel like this notion of the community pushback on a developer and how bad does the developer want to get this done leads into this notion of entering into a community benefits agreement with the developer that the developer would buy the lack of pushback or with community benefit. And we'll talk about that at a future episode. I think that's going to be a real key going forward. But it sounds like definitely the Housing Justice Coalition organization, and your mission is to build political power. It sounds like for seek housing justice. So I think that I think that we've been able to kind of get the idea of the theory of change. And the reason I kind of want to talk a little bit about that is that it's not your typical nonprofit that has, like a board and has this executive director and has these staffs and a website that has all the different people with their different bios. It's definitely a coalition but it's still covered by the North Carolina nonprofit law. And so I kind of wanted to kind of put that in context. And so I think we're now at a time where maybe we could, I put this picture here of Charlotte. I love this, as I've seen it like T-shirts and stuff being sold. I like it's a way. I had it when I was the law school to kind of understand like where I was going when I was, working with the law students in different neighborhoods in Charlotte. But if you're from any of these neighborhoods or outside, this would be a great time to talk, to ask some questions if you've got questions in the chat.
My first time seeing this. This is dope. This is a really dope it's a dope map.
It's great. You can see them every once in a while, like on posters or T-shirts. They're just kind of go to some of those local curio kind of shop places like almost that place in Dilworth, paper products or paper mache. You know what I'm talking about right there on East. Yeah. I think they sell like
paper skyscraper.
Okay, paper machine.
Yeah.
It's been a while. It's been a while.
The last thing I wanted to say was we basically just introduced like a committee structure. So my role is I am the head of the political education committee, and we also have like a policy committee that's very active. And that's really, so that's kind of how we do it. We have like committees, but then we also have our broad general body meetings where anybody who's interested in housing and stuff like that can come on, and we talk about a lot of stuff. And our thing is combining policy work with organizing with education, both political education of the broad structures, political and economic structures, and education on things like land use, rezoning, policy, and things like that, to work toward housing as a human right. So that's that.
Yeah, and so I asked Ismail to get me some information. So if you've been listening here and you're interested in questions, from the group about land use, housing, issues in Charlotte, and such, I mean, it's such a huge, broad, and again, we started sort of this change in the Friday with Rocky with discussing a little bit about the Chetty study and the notion of social mobility. You're not going to get much social mobility if you don't have a house. That's just, you don't have a place to live. It's real difficult. You don't have a job. You don't have other things. And so I think this is so I've got some information here if anyone is interested in getting involved with Ismail and other groups. So you could be a member of a group. So if you are part of a neighborhood group, or you're part of a nonprofit, or just a church, or anything of that nature, or you're just an individual, it sounds like you could join the coalition. So let me see. Do we have some questions here?
I would say our two main things, the things we're most active on right now are our Instagram and our Facebook. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we do have the Twitter, and you can join our primary housing justice mailing list that way too. And we also have like a housing educational policy mailing list, which is a little bit smaller as well. So those are.
I think one of the reasons I definitely wanted to have the Housing Justice Coalition here is I think that many of our discussions in like the last couple of discussions, when folks come in and they are from neighborhoods that are getting displaced or something, there's always been, it's always been sort of from we were close, but we just didn't get it done. And I think that the hope that you see with an organization like the Housing Justice Coalition is that, it is, and they're smart, and they're trying to, they're trying to, a theory of change and a theory for all of Charlotte. And I think that the question with Howie Acres is that that's a situation where the developer did not get their way and did not get to gentrify the neighborhood, the way they wanted to. And I think that when there's an old saying, and I think this is sort of is when it comes to community organizing, is that everyone's like, oh, other people have money and they're so powerful and they're so rich. I think that one thing that you learn about when you can organize enough people and you have enough education and you have enough you have like a goal, the idea is that they may have money, but you have people, and people can beat money. Not all the time, but it can. I think that is you look at elections and things of that nature from many, when there are opportunities there, and you can't get away from sort of the issues of the city council, the county commission, and who are they going to listen to? They may get campaign donations, sure, but there's also voters. There's also people in these neighborhoods, who I think that in my discussions with the folks in the far west Charlotte, I think they would have, if they would have known about the Housing Justice Coalition and worked earlier on in that process, we might have seen a different result with that land use decision. And I think that what we're going to see in Charlotte going forward and in the county is that that there is there are people who are tired of being sort of gentrified out of their neighborhood or just sort of having decisions made about what's going on with their community without their say. And I think that this is an important development, I think, in Charlotte, that's going on around the country. And so, I think that's just I think it's an important conversation. Okay, I think we've got some questions in the chat here. So I think we had Deborah Charles, and she asked that number one, she asked to share the contact info. So we've got that in the chat and also here on the screen. And then Deborah asks a question: how is the Housing Justice Coalition connected to the Continuum of Care efforts? Ismail, do you want to handle that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, my answer off the top of my head is no, but I also say that I could be wrong about that because we have like a lot of, we have kind of a core group of people that are very active and then like a secondary group. And so it could be that someone in our coalition is active, but to my knowledge, I would say no. But yeah, I can double check on that, particularly if somebody wants to follow up.
Mm-hmm. To the librarians, I know you guys always have like good questions and stuff. You guys have any questions for the Housing Justice Coalition?
Well, I was going to pivot back to the issue with the hotel evictions. You mentioned briefly that you had been in touch with the police over that matter, but I don't think you mentioned what their reaction was to that. I don't know if you could talk more about that. Were they receptive or?
Yeah, I mean, so, well, I think the tactic of a little bit back it up, the tactic of reaching out to, not reaching out, but kind of understanding like the police are going to be called and they're going to be asked to arrest people. Like I saw that happen when I was in New York and I was doing an internship where a couple of the paralegals were working with tenants and were almost arrested by the police because they got into a confrontation, particularly because they were saying, the police were saying they were called, the landlord was saying they were trespassers. So the idea basically is just to reach out to the precinct and then kind of let them know. To our knowledge, right, like no one was like at least like arrested like as being a trespasser. Like the tenants were able to actually kind of remain sheltered in the hotel, at least until, some may have left individually, but at least until like the fire marshal stepped in and basically told everybody they had to leave. So it was effective, from what we could see. I mean, people always fall through the cracks, but I definitely think the outcome would have been a lot worse. And like, yeah, I mean, also the fact that Sheriff McFadden showed up, I think probably acted as a bit of a deterrent as well. I mean, I'm not, like we can talk about a lot of things, but law enforcement, I think, plays a very particular role in kind of enforcing laws against poor people. And we have to be honest about that role. And that's what all the protests and everything has been about. So this is a tactic to try to protect people who are already vulnerable from having an interaction with law enforcement that can escalate and lead to something worse. And so that's really kind of, the approach we took.
And I'm assuming you mentioned the education group that you're leading with the book club discussions. A lot of these issues probably come up.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if you have any. Do you have any stories of impact from the discussion groups? Have you seen any net positive effect on the people who attend? Or
well, so I mean, yeah. So basically, like in a lot of ways, like the core group of people who attended have kind of become the core group of like organizers, researchers, and advocates from the Housing Justice Coalition. I mean, it was directly tied to, I think, us not only educating ourselves about housing as a human right, but also building camaraderie, and also, us kind of getting our feet wet and kind of pushing each other and being a support network for each other. But in a lot of ways, like all of this grew out of the reading group. I mean, like, in terms of, like, I don't think Howie Acres would have happened without the reading group. And I'll even go so far as to say, I don't think the situation with the hotel tenants would have happened, right? And I'm not trying to take credit for it or anything like that, but I think we were able to build like a kind of a core dedicated group of people with a clear understanding. And we worked with like, already professional organizers and other people. It's not like we were exclusive and we didn't want to talk to other people. It's like, it's the opposite. It's a coalition. But I think without that like clear, dedicated focus that comes from having like a very, evidence-based understanding of why this is happening, even if that evidence is really unpleasant and contradicts everything that we've been told about how our society actually works. I think when you have that and you have a group of people that support each other, you can do things that I never really would have thought a community. I'm from Charlotte. I never thought a community would be able to beat a developer. And the fact that like it's hard for me to like even kind of still believe like, and we have a very close relationship with Howie Acres, and we're continuing to support them in other ways and developing, their neighborhood association and strengthening, their community, organizing among themselves and a lot of things. But yeah, to answer your question, the core of it really was the reading group, honestly.
Yeah, and please feel free to share maybe your reading list with some of us, because we could promote that through the library. I don't know how open you are to opening the group up to other people, but at least if we would have a list of what you guys are reading, I think that would be great, especially if it's something that we don't own in the system, because we can order it.
Yeah, let me put my email in the chat. I mean, if you guys want to reach out to me directly and kind of ask that, I can kind of do a little bit more legwork and kind of, get you some good things, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story, and I mean, it's a perfect spawn. This discussion is being here with the public library, right? An institution that obviously has changed and has grown program, to put on presentations like this and other community needs, but ultimately has always been known as the place to get books and reading and to encourage knowledge. And I think that it's really kind of fantastic that, and I see it here in the chat, that it's just kind of fantastic that that the book club in some respects has led to activism that has led to actual things, victories for people who would been rolled, otherwise, right? I think it's kind of fantastic what education can do.
Yeah, and I guess I'm kind of over the whole like people talking about silver lining of the pandemic or whatever. It's really annoying, but it is really good that with Zoom events, when you're talking about coalitions, this has been a super efficient, easy way to bring people together who otherwise would not be sitting in the same physical space. So I guess that is one positive thing that will continue.
Yeah, and I do also want to just make it very clear with the Howie Acres situation. There were some very brilliant. There's some very brilliant and dynamic, matriarch Black women that really held it down and grew up in that community, and like they were the ones that really knocked on doors and pushed people, and were resilient in the face of it all. And we were there just to support and to provide some strategic suggestions, and like I said, it worked out, but and it's an ongoing relationship. But I really want to highlight that it was people in Charlotte, in Charlotte neighborhoods, that took a stand, who really so yeah.
You can't have the revolution without the people, right? You can't. You got to have they got to lead it. That's the real key there. And I think that that the Housing Justice Coalition is open to people that really care about housing justice in this community. That I guess it was like self-determination, that if they choose to do this, then that's fine. That's their decision. But I think that when an outside force that just sees profit and thinks that I can just build something here and make some money, and then I'll just go buy a couple properties here and try to do something, but it has a sort of an effect on the rest of the community, that the community does have a say. And I think that's sort of like, I think it's just a matter of communities in the neighborhoods and these communities here in Charlotte, just remembering that they still have hands that can do things. So yeah. Any other questions? I feel like I'm gonna just see here. I see something in the chat. I love the library. I love the library too. I mean, I've always loved the library. I mean, I was, where I grew up in Salisbury, every day after school, because my mother worked, I went to the public library, and I was there from 3 to 5. My mother can pick me up. I do my homework. I just, library just, helped raise me, so I'm always gonna, love the library. Let's see. Thank you for giving us more information on Housing Coalition, and can't wait to hear more from you. That's great. That's good stuff. Great feedback. Any other questions at this time from anybody? Because I think, I
will say, if you guys want to watch that community meeting with Larkin Eagleson, it's on our Facebook page. Oh. You can also see like some of the media coverage, and there's going to be an article coming out in the Charlotte Observer about Howie Acres as well. It should come out this month. So look for that as well. But yeah, you can check out, like, our Facebook page has like a lot of Howie Acres stuff on it if people want to look at it.
You'll learn more about the Battle of Howie Acres.
How's your relationship been with the press, the local press in Charlotte? Just out of curiosity, do you have certain reporters on speed dial, good contact?
I would say that in a lot of ways, like being a good organizer is building strategic relationships with journalists and reporters, because they provide, I think they provide like major visibility for what you're trying to do, which exerts pressure, and then in exchange, like like you give them a story, right? And particularly, I think community organizing is still very new. I mean, it's been happening in Charlotte for a while, but I think like there's still like a lot of novelty and a lot of room and a lot of interest in reporting and writing about it. And there are just some great people and some great reporters that are really interested in like these types of issues of housing and equity, particularly since these studies have been done. So yeah, I mean, I have, like reporters that I can reach out to and that are, I think, very interested in covering this kind of material.
Yeah, I know the Charlotte Journalism Collaborative, they're really focusing on housing issues right now. So I'm not sure if you're...
I'll check them out.
Yeah. Any questions from anyone else?
Greg, what was that group again? The Charlotte
Journalism Collaborative. One of the librarians at my branch recently started working with him, and I think it's a new group with people from various local reporting agencies. But I'll try to get more details about it. But I do know that housing issues are their focal point, so they definitely should get in touch with Ismail and Rocky, you as well. Maybe I'll invite them on for the next session that we have with you, which we still need other folks, by the way.
We can, I mean, I think that's, I think I love, I think that I'd love to see, Fridays with Rocky kind of touch on the topics that maybe we're not hearing as much on Charlotte Talks or some other areas that, we hear from some of the other, players, in the body politic of, and so, yeah, I'd love to, I'd love to touch base with the journalist collaborative, because it sounds like, I think that there's a lot of need for renaissance and reform and just change and evolution in journalism. I think obviously talking about all the newspapers have all been bought up by like the same, groups and it's like, there is a huge place for just organic, real news that people can, really use and can really learn from. That's just my opinion, but I think that would be great to connect with them. So I'd love to, you can email them and maybe put me into email there, and heck, throw Ismail on that email too. If you guys just let's meet the Charlotte Journalism Collaborative. I think that sounds cool. Any other questions, guys? This is you shouldn't just be us just hogging the thing here. But if that's the case, then that's good. And so if there are no other questions, I just want to thank Ismail for your time coming on and joining us here with Fridays with Rocky, and of course, big up to the Charlotte Mecklenburg Public Library, because without them, we wouldn't have our monthly program, and we'll keep providing some content that I hope that folks can really get some use out of, that you're not going to find elsewhere. I think we're looking to, talk about things that, that need to be talked about, but may not be getting as much play elsewhere. Yeah. And the nonprofit, of course, because this is nonprofit services, so we'll always tie it into nonprofits.
And thank you guys a lot too. I mean, I'm really to both the library and to you, Rocky, as well. I'm really happy to be here. It's good stuff.
Yeah, we'd obviously love to have you back and get some updates.
We will. There's going to be plenty more. There's more coming up the pike. I can just tell you that. There's a lot of action going on in the community. And so we'll maybe this will be the mouthpiece for it until it gets to the Charlotte Observer. Until Mike.
Yeah, and it will be on YouTube. So on the library channel. So feel free to share that as much as you can. So the more we get the word out, the more we can, gain more support and become more of a voice here with Fridays with Rocky and the nonprofit services of the library.
Yeah, and I mean, if you are involved with nonprofits or thinking about starting one, it has, I'm going to put in my plug, but it has fantastic resources. I mean, Ismail, if you're ever involved with a nonprofit, like even if you, or a nonprofit that wants to become a 501c3 or something like that, the library has access to it was formerly the Foundation Center, but it's like the grant search engine for free. So a lot of nonprofits actually pay a pretty pricey subscription for this same grant search thing. I know when I was running a nonprofit, I thought about it. I looked at the price, like, nah, But the library, if the wonderful thing about being part of the Mecklenburg, community is that your library system, has access for free. As long as you have a library card, you can go and search grants for yourself, for other groups, that are out there, from foundations and corporations and other groups like that. So there's a great symbiotic relationship between the nonprofits out there and also the library itself. And it's just a safe space and just a great learning environment for and almost like an incubator for those who are in the social sector and the nonprofits. I mean, it's as good or better than any college. It's good.